Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what we hope will be a very useful and interesting session. It's just over a year since lockdown started. I think sometimes it feels like much longer than that, but it does feel finally that we are beginning to emerge from this extraordinary period of our lives, both professionally and personally. And as of today, more than 30 million have had the first vaccine. Monday saw the latest easing of restrictions and the opportunity to meet more than one household and return to some of our passions, specifically in outdoor sports. In less than 2 weeks, we will be able to get a haircut, go to the gym, re-experience the joys of shopping, and enjoy a drink and food in a garden somewhere. And the sun is shining, so things do feel a lot brighter. And we are already observing quite significant increases in traffic numbers, certainly since schools returned, and just that there are more and more people out and about. So it does feel like the right time for us at Kinetic to be thinking positively about the future. We have seen really strong movements in market demand over the past few weeks as brands plan for the return to real life. Out of home is back, though things will continue to be different, I think, from where we were in 2019 for a while, as people's behaviours continue to be shaped by different working patterns and lifestyle changes, certainly in the immediate future and perhaps longer term, though I think it's very difficult to assess what the long-term implications will be. So what people do and how they feel as we hopefully move out and away from the horrors of COVID is going to be both fascinating and critical in understanding the role that out of home has to play as we shake off the hangover of 2020 and 2021 properly kicks in. So we commissioned an insight study earlier this month of over 1,000 respondents to try and understand how the government's unlocking announcement would affect people's travel habits, what factors would influence this, and how our clients should use their out-of-home marketing to maximise this opportunity, but also really how people are feeling. And Jenny Roper, our head of insight, is going to share the findings of this study today. We then have a wonderful opportunity to get a perspective on what all of this means for brands and businesses from outside of our media bubble. And I will be joined by City analyst Ian Whitaker to discuss in more detail. And he always provides a very interesting perspective. So very much looking forward to that. But firstly, let's hear from Jenny and what we have learned from the research that we've done.
Thank you, Ali, and hello, everyone. So we've really missed things. The pandemic has taken away things from our lives that we used to take for granted. We've missed being outside. We've missed our friends. We've missed our family. And we've missed the hustle and bustle of city life. And we have missed the in-person interactions with work colleagues. People feel the impact of a loss twice as much as they enjoy acquiring a gain. Andre Agassi once said, "A win doesn't feel as good as a loss feels bad." And as a Spurs fan, I can totally empathise with that sentiment. Think back to the start of the pandemic, when you began to work from home. Remember how you felt financially when you no longer needed to pay for your train fare for your daily commute. Now, fast forward to June 2021, when many people will be returning to the office and you start paying to commute into work again. It's the same amount of money, yet the financial loss will feel worse when you start to commute again compared to the financial gain that you felt at the start of the pandemic when you stopped commuting into work. And this is understood through loss aversion. The pandemic was a catalyst for a sense of lost time, which is creating a need for people to treat themselves. And this, paired with an elevated sense of happiness amongst the public, delivers a perfect storm that brands can capitalise upon. Since the roadmap out of lockdown was announced in early March, the mood of the nation is more positive. Our Alfresco Life data shows the level of positivity is constant among more traditional demographics like age and sex. And these are the demographics that we would normally plan against. But our analysis shows that people are more positive about the end of lockdown if they have children at home or if they think they have had COVID. We are even more positive when we're outside. Out of home is a key medium to reach people when they are in a positive mood. Our Journeys platform offers the opportunity for smarter and more adaptable planning. It enables us to plan beyond traditional demographics and helps us to tap into positive mood moments that drive positive brand associations. And the work of Burnett and Field shows these factors are key to long-term profitable growth. Our mood also affects our immediate cognitive processes and choices. When we're in a better mood, we tend to make unrealistically optimistic judgments. It's not just the thought of the end of lockdown that puts us in a positive mood. Sunlight and vitamin D are also mood enhancers. Yet we often underestimate the influence of emotions and sunlight on our purchase decisions. This is known as the empathy gap and is demonstrated through an experiment that the IPA conducted. So they analysed different executions of a direct marketing campaign for a finance brand that wanted to increase the uptake of a specific loan. The IPA found that showing a photo of a smiling person increased demand for the loan by the same amount as a 25% reduction in the monthly interest rates. Relative changes in temperature and mood are key drivers for sales in the short term. When analysing ice cream sales data, it is true that more ice cream is sold in the summer months. However, spikes in sales are not linked to passing an absolute temperature threshold. Rather, a sharp increase in either temperature or sunlight shows a direct correlation with an increase in sales. Our decisions are influenced through frames of reference. So relative changes are the key driver to sales rather than absolute levels. And through the use of algorithms, alfresco life and programmatic out of home, brands should upweight their out of home activity to the regions where the weather is relatively better and the mood is relatively negative. We are on the precipice of a return to positivity. Our alfresco life data indicates that people return to the high street the fastest. Compared to the end of lockdown 1, we're more comfortable returning to public spaces. Within this context, we must remember that relative to private social media channels, out of home is great at pushing brand fitness and social fitness signals that in turn drive trust and purchase intent. And as I spoke about last year, and as JC Decaux and Clear Channel spoke about earlier this month, trust becomes more important in these times of uncertainty. Brands should use out of home to capitalise on these changes, and Kinetic has built Journeys to do this. So Journeys is a behavioural audience platform that ingests mobile SDK data and fuses this with lots of other data sets. Journeys can both quickly and easily identify audiences based on a variety of data inputs. We overlay this with Root. This means we can find the right audience based on the right behavioural attitudes, rather than a set of predefined demographics. The result is faster, smarter and more adaptable planning that increases the effectiveness of out-of-home marketing. So there is a changing mood with the nation feeling more positive. Through journeys and alfresco life, we can see current and predict future changing audience patterns. And we are using this data to find the relative mood highs. Our insights allow us to plan out of home smarter and find the environments people are returning to the fastest. The pandemic has changed opinion of being in shared public spaces. So we're examining the data to find the optimum moment for brands to be present in different public spaces for different audiences. With lots of changes, people need more reassurance. But remember, when you change the medium to out of home, you improve trust, brand and social fitness signals. And working with Kinetic and using alfresco life and first party client data, we can optimise these sweet spots. And in this final section, I'm going to apply these findings to two different age demographics. I will look at this in the context of a younger audience within a fashion vertical, and then I will look at an older audience for the travel sector. Both categories have different audiences and different challenges that they faced during the pandemic. In both of these instances, I will demonstrate the benefit of applying insight and data to each of their out-of-home marketing solutions. So first, let's think about an online fashion brand whose key objective is to grow by reaching a Gen Z audience. Now, there are three key facts that we know. Firstly, Gen Z can't wait to get back to socialising. They've missed going to the shops and can't wait to treat themselves to new outfits for their nights out. Secondly, Gen Z will return to the high street quickly, faster than any other traditional demographic. And finally, Gen Z are comfortable returning to public spaces, more so than any other traditional demographic. Gen Z, like other revenge spenders, have a carefree attitude paired with financial stability. They want to go to the shops and buy clothes as soon as they are allowed. This group are not sitting at home day in, day out. They are out and about. We can find these people behaviourally through our Journeys platform. Out of home should be deployed now to build salience for revenge spenders. For this audience, it's not just about seeing the ad for the latest fashions. You want to know that your friends are seeing this too. And this is known as cultural imprinting. Whether you drink Peroni or Heineken or Brewdog, it says something about you. It's been imprinted on the broader culture by an ad campaign. It's then up to you to decide whether you want to align yourself with it. How will you be seen if you bring Peroni rather than Brewdog to the party? And these are the thoughts that we're going through Gen Z's minds when they want to buy the latest looks they see in an ad campaign. It's why so many online fashion brands advertised around Love Island. If brands want to capture initial purchases when stores reopen, they need to use out of home to build salience and cultural imprinting now, to capture purchases when stores reopen tomorrow. Now, let's turn to the travel sector and focus on a brand that wants to grow audiences or grow by reaching an older audience. For this demographic, we really didn't see them veer much from the norm in regard to going outside. However, this is a more cautious audience. Like everyone else, over 55s are excited by the end of lockdown. However, they're more likely to wait to book a holiday. A key difference with this audience is that they have money to spend. This cautious but financially secure audience are defined as rationers. Out of home should be used to reach rationers in a positive mood, and this can be achieved through our Journeys platform. Premium large and small digital out-of-home sites should be used to inspire this group for their future travel plans. And travel brands really are missing a trick by putting their reassuring messages on social media. If you want to build trust in your brand, if you want people to believe that you are guaranteeing bookings, or that you really are employing COVID-safe measures, you need to say this publicly. Out of home is a public media that is proven to drive trust. Brands that want to capture pent-up travel spend should use out of home to inspire for the future and reassure in the here and now. Whether cautious or carefree, now is the time to invest in out-of-home marketing. Brands need to act now to reap the benefits of tomorrow. Now is the time people are feeling more positive. Now is the time to look beyond traditional demographic segmentations. Now is when people are thinking about spending the money they have saved during the pandemic. Now is the perfect time to invest in out of home. And now is the time to hand back to Ali.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. That was fascinating stuff, and I think it's definitely very true that we sometimes don't realise how we value or miss things until they're taken away, which has certainly been the case during COVID. So I'm delighted to now introduce you all to Ian Whitaker to help discuss these findings further and what they might mean for businesses and brands. And as I mentioned up front, we really wanted a view from someone from outside of out of home who spends their time perhaps talking to a different constituency of people. Ian has very kindly joined us today to share his perspective. He is the current City AM Analyst of the Year, and he's won it twice. He's a city analyst that has been covering the media and digital sectors for more than 20 years and is older than he looks. Working as a city analyst and head of media, he's worked at places like Liberum, UBS and Bank of America, and is on the board of several ventures, and now is the founder of Liberty Sky Advisors, which provides a range of services, including helping companies to find the most suitable financing options and providing advice at both a strategic and financial level. So fascinating to have you here with us today, Ian. Thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
I was just going to kick off by asking you what you've missed most during COVID.
Oh, God, take your pick. A real mixture of things. I think just going out, having a nice meal, sitting with friends, going on holiday, even things such as exercise. I mean, I did a sort of outdoor exercise sort of lessons with sort of a group of people who've now become friends with. Haven't been able to do that. So just can't wait for things to actually, for this lockdown to end.
Yeah, and I think that is, the sentiment that we saw in the research is really positive, and we've been talking internally about, with a fair win, this could be a summer of life where people, really get back to what they love and they've missed. And I suspect that particularly for younger age groups, they're going to have a whale of a time this summer. But yeah, the sentiment is really positive. I was just going to start off by asking you really about the impact of COVID on the economy, because that potentially is longer term. And I mean, I certainly think we'll see a boost this summer in terms of spending, etc. I was just wondering how you thought this period of uncertainty and change differs from recessions and the turbulence that we've experienced in the past, and what might be the same, or what can we learn, and what can we expect?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think if you look at what's gone on, I think the obvious analogy is to say, what about the 2008-2009 financial crisis? And I think sort of this crisis is going to have more long-term fundamental effects than that one, because that was predominantly a financial sort of issue, and what happened about governments pumping in liquidity. Very much with this has very much been not just about sort of people's economic welfare, but also as well their personal welfare as well. And also as well, the impact it's had on society, the fact that people haven't been able to go out and see relatives and families and so forth. So I suspect actually the consequences will be a lot more sort of a lot more fundamental. and potentially longer in time. I mean, the closest analogy I would probably use for this is more like an impact from war. And what I mean by that is that essentially just as in those times, you had governments taking extraordinary measures in order to combat the threat that they saw. And what you generally saw was that at least some of those measures tended to go along into peacetime. I suspect this is going to be very much the sort of case here with what governments do. There's also as well then an issue of consumer habits, sort of how they've changed. To sort of talk about, the old adage is a new habit takes 6 weeks to form. Well, obviously we've been considerably sort of past that stage. And I think a third sort of impact that we're going to see on the consumer is potentially what you could see is consumers not necessarily taking everything for granted. I mean, there's a great Michael McIntyre sketch that talks about sort of being back in 2019 and being sort of told by a fortune teller about what was going to happen with things like furlough and everything like that. Completely sort of, if somebody had told you that back in 2019, sort of it would have been seen as crazy. And yet sort of it's actually happened. So I suspect what will also happen as well is you will get a degree of consumers sort of while they will definitely go out to spend, definitely want to experience things, that will very much be this bounce back that will come. At the same time as well, I suspect there will also be an innate sort of conservatism and caution that will be lingering because of what has happened. And that may reflect it in certain areas.
Do you think that'll be different by different audiences?
I think so. I think you will probably see, I mean, if I look at the if you look at the different audiences, obviously if you're sort of Gen Z, if you're younger generations, there has been sort of a concern about your jobs. You're very much just at the start of your working career. There are obviously knock-on effects in terms of long-term wealth. There are effects in terms of having to move back in with your parents and so forth. And so I think for that generation, I mean, it could be argued that actually sort of it compounds certain of the other sort of effects have been through. On the other hand, I think what you'll also get as well is a very strong rebound effect. So if you take, for example, Live Nation, we're talking about sort of their 3 festivals, sort of 180,000 tickets sold out within 3 days. You look at pub bookings as well, sort of have gone through the roof. So I think there's going to be a very sort of strong bounce back element there. I think when it comes to sort of more mature demographics or older demographics, sort of Jen was talking about 55 plus and so forth. Again, I think, there will be an element there that people very much want to spend. There is one of the things that this sort of crisis has shown you is that time is limited and it can be literally taken away sort of very, very quickly. So
I think that age group's really interesting because what we forget is, last summer, a lot of the younger audiences were out and about again. But for a lot of the 55 pluses, they were still shielding or more restrictive or more cautious. So I think you might be right. We might see some of that purchasing power being unlocked because, as we know, that's where all the money is anyway, isn't it?
exactly.
I just go to when it comes to sort of bounce back, and I think your analogy with the war is interesting because you do see that short-term kind of feel-good factor, and then the longer-term implications take a while to sort of impact. But what would you expect in terms of the categories that will benefit the most in the shorter term?
I think probably sort of what you'll see, I think main beneficiaries will be ones, I think there will be across the board field, but I think probably the main categories that will benefit are those which are seen as essentially experience based and more outdoor based. So things like travel, for example, sort of would expect to come back. Sort of hospitality, as you can already see, sort of some of this is already happening, as I said, with sort of live events and go on. You possibly, ironically, could see an area like cars. Given the whole things of what's happening in terms of public transport and whether people sort of feel as though they need to be more sort of more in their sort of personal space when they travel to work as well. I think retail and fashion probably will do quite well as well. You're already seeing articles talking about, are we going to see a return of sort of smart dressing? There's sort of a bounce back from the hoodies and the slacks and so forth that will come through. I think also as well, what could be quite an interesting area, it's not sort of technically sort of so much spending, but I think personal finance as well. Again, it goes back to this point that sort of there was a sudden wrench in terms of people's lives, and many people found themselves suddenly without, what are we going to do in terms of cash? Their personal financial situation suddenly became sort of precarious. And I think, again, there'll probably be a sort of effect on that where people will say, we probably need to sort of look more at our own personal finances.
And I mean, you work with a lot of businesses on a strategic level. What sense do you get of how they may respond to all of this? And particularly I'm thinking about, if the last year has been predicated by a life lived online, and obviously e-commerce has gone through the roof and people have burnt through Netflix, etc., etc. What sense do you get about how brands might shift in the way that they behave and invest in marketing as we move away from the lockdown? And obviously you've written quite a lot about this recently.
I think for many brands, it's going to be a very interesting time. I mean, if you were to look, for example, who could be the winners sort of and the losers from this and how it will affect their advertising spend, I think e-commerce, for example, even though the growth may slow, sort of there's been a permanent step up in terms of, and again, it goes back to this habit formation standpoint. Now that has some very interesting implications. For example, if your brand, if, for example, I'm a sort of brand that interacts with the consumer, one of the issues that I think many of these brands will face is that when a consumer goes into a supermarket, the brand is able to benefits from the historic recall as a shopper is going down the aisles and sort of physically taking all the products. In an e-commerce environment, a lot more of the transaction is actually guided by the intermediary, whether that be somebody like Amazon or the retailer itself. So I think for many brands, the issue becomes that how do you make sure that the consumer knows to go direct to your brand first and comes into that environment to think about that brand and buying specifically that brand, rather than necessarily be guided by the intermediary who may not have your best interests at heart. So I think from an advertising perspective, I think the whole thing about particularly FMCG groups and how they advertise in the e-commerce environment, I think that's particularly relevant, particularly this whole idea of what's sometimes called Q-commerce takes hold, which is you have a series of small warehouses dotted around with goods delivered by delivery drivers within an hour. The whole of idea of that concept is you only have a limited number of brands per item on there. So you think about that, the potential consequences for the long tail are absolutely frightening if that takes off, because obviously then you're cut out of a large percentage of the market. So I think you have that element that is there. I think also as well, potentially you could see some quite interesting, if you want to call them losers, from this. And I think when saying that, I think there'd be certain categories where you would expect growth to slow. For example, food delivery. In terms of that, I think it will still do very, very well, but obviously not the phenomenal growth rates of before. But an interesting category, for example, may be the streaming services. If, for example, really boosted by the lockdown and people staying at home, well, what happens if everyone wants to get out? What happens to the growth there? Do people suddenly feel as though, that they want these streaming services? And this is a more fundamental point in itself and probably worth a further exploration. But I think one of the things that is going to happen is whereas the amount of time that people may spend at home will probably stay the same or maybe slightly increase because people are working from home a couple of days a week. What may happen is where the what they do at home will change. So most of their time is spent at work, and what they may want to do in their leisure time is actually get more out. And that could have some quite interesting implications as well.
Well, I think certainly in the shorter term, going back to what Jenny was saying in terms of all the things we've missed, if I saw a Bloomberg analyst talk recently about, life has been lived online for the next 6 months, it will be lived offline.
Yeah.
And then we will go back to something more balanced in the winter. And I just wonder how, you see that impacting on how people use different channels. In terms of advertising, what would you expect, or what would you be suggesting to your clients that they're doing in terms of where they put their ad dollars?
Well, I think it goes back to one of the points you just said previously, is that I think for a large number of categories, I think that essentially brand advertising will be a lot more important, because if we do see this permanent step up in terms of e-commerce activity and more goods being bought online, online it is a vast jungle. And if people don't know where to go, then they can be easily guided by the intermediaries who can say, go to this particular area and so forth. So again, I think, and it's not just FMCG groups, I think this comes across a variety of different categories. What you need to do is to get hold of the consumer right at that point. And that, I think, weighs very much on the whole idea of brand advertising spend. And I'd argue that actually brand advertising spend probably is more important within this market. One of the things that have argued as well, and the sort of converse is that too much money is spent on search and performance marketing. And you're already starting to see that in the likes of Airbnb, for example, take spend away and increase questions about performance marketing. I think that would be also increased as well by the sort of changes all around privacy. But yeah, there's been too much attribution that has been granted to these performance marketing models, where actually, if you look at, for example, when people go into Google and what sort of they're searching for, sort of a lot of the time they already know what they're searching for. They may just not know the web address. So it's not the Google search that is driving the sale. Sort of, it's actually more the brand beforehand. But the way that the attribution models are done at the moment, it attributes it more the sale to the Google sort of influence than it does to the brand. So my view is there needs to be sort of a lot more sort of refocusing on brand. In the UK, it's like 40% of spend is brand, 60% activation. Yeah, there's an argument for saying it should be at least inverted.
But I think we've been talking about these sorts of things for a long time, and how, you know, the last decade has been characterized by an increasing addiction to one-to-one marketing at scale, and a lot of sort of private marketing. And I think one of the things we actually learned through COVID was the importance of public messaging. You know, if you look at the channel that the government used for some of their most powerful messaging was out of home, even though the audiences weren't there, because they understood the impact of it, and certainly from a media perspective and social media, etc. But I do think, and you know, we really believe that in terms of brand fitness and in terms of giving people confidence and the necessary messages, if you say it in public, you're saying it in public, and you can't hide. And I think brands recognize that. The challenge is when you've become so wed to an attribution model, and particularly because you talk to a lot of CFOs and CEOs, I think it's quite difficult to sometimes to convince clients that there is a better way, a better balance. And obviously we're looking at specifically from an out of home perspective, and you know, if life is lived outdoors again, then that should be really good for out of home. But what are the things that we need to be thinking about in ensuring that we can get brands to understand that out of home should be a big part of regaining brand fitness and driving growth in the coming months?
Well, I think, you know, what would say there needs to be a conversation at a number of different levels. And one of the points in the recent piece that published on the UK advertising sector was really a call to arms to say, really at both levels, I think. I think sort of amongst CMOs there's a need, as it were, to speak the language of the board, to speak the language of the CFOs, and really sort of, you know, backed up by proper agnostic sort of analysis of data, that they can use that to strengthen their case, and then go to boards and company management CFOs and say, look, you know, you need to spend, if you spend this amount of money, these are the return, this is the return on investment that you should expect. But I think also as well, sort of the flip side of that is also there's a requirement with on boards, CFOs, CEOs to really take advertising more seriously. I mean, advertising, when you look at it, my view on it is that advertising is intangible capex. Just as plan in order to grow sales. So also as well, they invest in their sort of advertising their brands in order to do the same as well. But I think the problem has become is that there's sort of been very much this whole idea of advertising is wasted. The sort of talk about 50% is wasted. I just don't know which half. That has become very much the sort of, I'd say, the consensus thinking amongst boards. And when you start to think about that as sort of that spend as a cost to be minimized as opposed to an investment to grow the top line, then your whole sort of your whole rationale changes. And I think one of the things I would say that the online companies have been very good, particularly likes of Google, is to turn around and say, look, we have this model that can scientifically prove you that if you do this, it will lead to Y. Now, yeah, there is a vested interest. There's a classic story of Adidas, you know, when they looked at Google AdWords going down, that essentially realized it had no impact on e-commerce sales. And for me, the most striking thing about that was the fact that of the 4 attribution models they were using to determine where they should spend money, 2 were provided by Google, 1 by Facebook, and 1 by Adobe. I mean, you had people with a vested interest sort of saying you should spend on our platform, which is, to me anyway, is absolutely crazy. But I think that just goes to show you in terms of the sort of part in which I think a lot of these companies have captured the debate by saying that essentially there is a scientific sort of calculation that you can go through, sort of, which is not necessarily the case, in order to promote their own vested interests. And I think on the other side as well, knowing that that plays very well to the whole ideas of particularly the CFOs, that again, advertising's a cost to be minimized, it can be measured, and therefore, you know, that sort of going down this path makes sense. And then you've got the CMOs in the middle who, you know, often are, and it's not meant as a sort of criticism, but are obviously often not coming from analytical backgrounds, are under a lot of pressure. There's a large churn of CMOs, which in my mind is, you know, sort of suggests that essentially firms don't take advertising seriously. And of course, they're under pressure to actually sort of give the solution that they know that their managements want. And that again sort of means that they feed into the sort of attribution model. My sort of points to them would be, you know, I go back to what I said before, you get proper agnostic analysis of data. It's been proven time and time again. CMOs can use that to take their messages to boards, because what boards, company management's really interested in, sort of top line performance, earnings performance, how well their company is doing. And if you want an example of that, look at what Procter & Gamble has done over the past couple of years. You know, revamped its advertising, accelerated top line growth, accelerated earnings, and also as well massively accelerated the share price.
Yeah, it's been very successful for them. I was just, whilst you were talking, I was just thinking, actually, the other conversation you must be having quite a lot is businesses trying to understand what the future of work and life looks like. One of the things that has been quite frustrating over the last few months is that people have a very fixed view of what it might be. So you've got companies coming out and saying it's 3 and 2 in the office and at home, or even Goldman saying everybody's coming into the office. But I guess if you're going to pay people that much, that's fine. Just wondered whether you had a view, and even something people might not have thought about in terms of the future of our cities, because obviously that impacts on how we use out of home and other media channels to reach people. You know, what might happen to the high street, or is there anything that you sort of feel people haven't really thought about in terms of trying to predict what the future of audience behaviours might be?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I think definitely there is this. I go back to the point that I said at the beginning in terms of the sort of the effects of this pandemic. The consequences could actually be more like what's happened in wars. You know, when you look at sort of what happens sort of either World War I, World War II, you get very significant societal changes that come through. Now, obviously, this is of a sort of lesser duration, and obviously it's not the sort of the widespread destruction you've seen in those wars. But I think where that sort of does count in this whole idea that perceptions change and what people are willing to sort of consider acceptable or not do also change as well. And I think sort of very much from the work pattern as to, different employers have different standards. Goldman's has obviously said about sort of their return to work, other banks such as Lloyd, HSBC has talked about sort of more hybrid working and so forth. So I think we will see a greater variety of working patterns. Bear in mind as well, for many companies, it also sort of suits them as well. So they sort of don't have the property costs. There's an element there of sort of what they can pay their workers if their workers are sort of living in cheaper areas. So there's productivity issues as well. So many companies are going to look at this, and part is going to be based on what's good for them. It's going to be part also as well, I think, on what's acceptable for households. I mean, a big issue also as well, bear in mind, which often doesn't get talked about, is legal liability. You know, if you force your workers back to work and somebody gets sort of COVID and so forth, can you sue them? Can the employee sue? And so that's a sort of factor, sort of for quite a few companies thinking things as well. My view is what will happen is I think you will get sort of this hybrid sort of mixture, and there'll be a sort of a spectrum of working patterns that will come through. And this obviously has been sort of shown during the pandemic. Now, I think what it means for cities, what it means for towns, I think for the local communities, you've obviously got people who are there during the day and will want to take a break or want to get out and so forth. So I think sort of there's a benefit there for the local shops. But I think at the same time as well, I think with cities still continues to do very well, because while there may be sort of as it were, a reduction in volume in terms of the amount of traffic that comes through during the week, personal view that what will happen is that essentially people sort of, if they've been working from home, what they will want to do is get out sort of into the city sort of in non-working hours, whether that's sort of the weekend or whether it's the evening and so forth. So I think what you get is actually more an issue that sort of city traffic sort of goes into different patterns, sort of rather than necessarily the absolute volume that goes down. And I'd say that probably has some opportunities there because, yeah, let's say, for example, you are talking specifically about out of home, you are somebody who's sort of advertising during the day in sort of a working environment. Is there an opportunity, for example, for some as it were those national brand advertising on outdoor screens to be taken over by local small businesses, who are targeting people at particular times? So I think it will require a little bit of sort of reimagination and so forth, but I think the opportunity sort of is very much there. So I definitely don't subscribe to the view that this is the death of cities. Yeah, I think sort of very much what we will see is that the way that people use cities, I think that is the thing that will change.
And it is interesting, isn't it? Because people were talking about the death of the local high street, but certainly through this latest lockdown, my local high street is busier than ever because people are happy to queue for half an hour for a coffee.
Yeah.
So there's been lots and lots of sort of new not restaurants, more sort of food operations opening, delis, fishmongers, that kind of stuff. And those behaviours I think might sustain. So in a weird way, COVID may have rejuvenated the local high street.
No, I think that's right, but I think it's also I think that's definitely true because again, even if you have people working 2 days a week from home and they want to get out for a walk, that by itself is quite a considerable amount of traffic. I think also as well though, I wouldn't write off necessarily the high street. And I think one of the issues here that's going to be very interesting is, if you kind of look at what's happened with the high street. I mean, my argument would be that essentially the high street sort of needs to be reinvented. And this, of course, I mean, I'm not sort of, I don't claim to be, as it were, a retail specialist and so forth. But the high street has become very bland in things. If you go back in fact, well, you could see it now. You look at places like Westfield, for example, get great traffic. Why is that? Because they're destination places to go to. People actively want to go there because they actually enjoy the place and so forth. And so there's a case for arguing that maybe what sort of high streets need to do is very much go back to the future, as it were. And if you sort of, you go back, for example, the days of the department stores, and if you take, for example, sort of Weimar Germany in 1920s, supermarkets were essentially seen as entertainment palaces. This whole idea of
all they happened through COVID, that's for sure.
Well, they have
but the only place we could go.
Well, that's very true, but I mean, if you look at the entertainment that's on offer, and certainly compare with what would be on offer, let's say 100 years ago, in terms of what those sort of big department stores offer, you'd say today's offering is extremely bland. So I think sort of what you've got there is the high street. There's a lot of potential assets sitting within the high street. For a start, their space and the sort of buildings they've got to do. I think what need to do though is really reimagine how that space is used and how actually attract sort of consumers coming in, because I think increasingly for the high street this will be all about why exactly should people come to me? What do I need to do to attract? And without sort of being pejorative or anything, a high street that has got a couple of sort of chains of coffee shops and sandwich bars probably isn't going to do it. For a lot of people, there needs to be something more fundamental. But I go back to the Westfield example before. It can be done, and it can be done very successfully.
And I think your point about reimagination is really interesting, because I think if you look at big periods of turbulence, the people that win are those that innovate and look to new opportunities as a result. I mean, I think we're certainly going to see that over the next 2 years. Hopefully this summer we'll just see people out and enjoying everything, and we can capture them throughout home. Listen, we could carry on talking for a long time, I suspect. We are out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you very, very much for your time and your perspective, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Indeed. No, it'd be great. Thanks very much, Ali.
Cheers, Ian. Thank you.
Take care.
As always, some fascinating insights there from Ian, and thanks to him once again for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we really are starting to see the market respond to the easing of restrictions, and actually we're seeing some real availability challenges through the summer already. So as Jenny said, now is really the time to be thinking about the role that out of home will play as we move through the year. Advertising industry forecasts are currently projecting out of home will be one of the fastest recovering media channels this year, and we believe they are rightly optimistic, not simply as demand rises with the return to real life. I think what is really going to help out of home build back better is a function actually of all the investment and development in out of home that was in play before the pandemic hit and has been accelerated through the past 12 months as we've had to innovate our way through the challenge. So whether that's smarter data-driven planning, where we are using real-world data purposefully to deploy relevant, real-time, reactive messaging, which enables clients to flex and respond to shifting patterns of audience behaviours. There's the really interesting dynamic between out of home as the public screen alongside mobile as the private screen, and out of home connecting the online and offline world through digital out of home, delivering measurable influence and action in both physical and online environments, driving search, social and e-commerce as people are out and about. Automated trading and programmatic out of home continues to develop at pace, and obviously out of home can now be deployed in near real time, again allowing campaigns to flex and respond to changes in audience behaviours faster and smarter than ever before, and also at a time when it's getting harder to reach large numbers of people, enabling us to deliver diverse audiences at scale. A lot of work has been done on out of home as a platform for good, and the role that out of home plays as advertisers do think harder about where their money is spent. Out of home is editorial free, increasingly carbon neutral, a net contributor to urban environments, and also increasingly financially challenged local services and transport networks, as Clear Channel have been pointing out. 50p in every pound spent on out of home goes towards those services. And finally, out of home really is the home of creativity and innovation now. No other media channel offers the increasingly dynamic, technology-driven creative opportunities to maximize impact and effect, whether that's exploding jars of Marmite, street art, augmented reality, or just location and context-specific messaging. So lots of reasons for positivity. Thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the sunshine while it lasts, and we hope you all have a very, very happy Easter break, and we look forward to talking to you after. Thank you.